This is the Ideology podcast. I am your host, Elka Kubaku, licensed social worker and psychotherapist. In this podcast, we explore divisive issues around food, health, and body image with the goal of mending relationships within the eating disorder recovery professional community and creating a space where a multiplicity of perspectives can coexist harmoniously. This podcast is uncensored and encompasses the political and ideological spectrum. If you believe something you hear is harmful or misinformed, please be respectful to the speaker. And also, feel free to reach out about recording another episode on the same topic from your vantage point. My hope is that if, as professionals, we can hold each other's stories with respect and compassion, we'll be better able to do so for our clients. Is it a therapist's responsibility to advocate for social justice and to take a stance on political issues that impact the lives of their clients or of minoritized groups? Or are therapists supposed to be apolitical and to enter the therapy space without an ideological agenda so that they can hold space for whatever belief systems the client brings in? When we remove the shoulds and the supposed to, or the moralistic judgments of what makes a good or bad therapist or a good or bad person, what we're left with are very important and impactful clinical questions, such as what role do systemic forces play in the issues we face as individuals? What impact does acknowledging these systemic forces have on a person's healing process? How do we address shame and internalized oppression in a way that empowers rather than disables? And how do we make impactful political issues speakable in the therapy space? In this episode, Allyson Inez Ford talks about the role that understanding systemic oppression played in her own recovery from an eating disorder. She discusses the systems that shape us, the role that politics play in how she holds the therapy space, and how she relates to clients and others who hold different and potentially very triggering political viewpoints. Because one thing that is for certain is that so many people are holding so much pain around current events. We cannot shy away from these topics. Allyson is a licensed mental health therapist specializing in eating disorders and obsessive compulsive disorder. She has experience working with adults and adolescents in individual, group, and family therapy across multiple levels of care. Her work is informed by a liberatory and anti-oppressive perspective. Allyson has a particular interest in supporting individuals with multiple marginalized identities, drawing from her own experience as a multiracial, neurodivergent, and queer clinician. Allyson owns and operates a group private practice, hosts a podcast focused on eating disorders and social justice, and participates in speaking engagements and professional trainings. She also provides consultation for complex clinical cases. Hi, Allyson.
Hi, Elka. Hello.
You have a pretty strong online presence around body justice or the intersection between body image, social justice. Can you start by telling me what makes that feel important to you?
Yeah, there's so many reasons. It really started with my own personal journey in recovery, and I went through my own journey in, gosh, like 2009, I think is when it started. I had an eating disorder for several years at that point. And, standard story in terms of like it took me a while to find the right fit and the right approach. I think I cycled through 4 or 5 therapists before finding the one that I really clicked with. And I was lucky, really lucky to, A, have that access, and B, to find her. I feel like therapy is such a unique experience where like you could have a clinician that is trained in all the things and that is so knowledgeable, but you could just like not vibe with them. Like there's just something a little bit, I kind of call it magical, even though I know that might be like too woo-woo for some people, but there's just something about two souls that just click. And so, yeah, I found my therapist at the time, and she helped me so much in my journey of healing my relationship to food and body. And, it had lots of ups and downs, as it always did, or always does. And there was so much that we worked through. However, there was also things left out, and I don't think it was a reflection of her clinical ability. I think it was a reflection of the field at the time. And, again, this was back in like the 2010s, and we've come a long way since then. But at that time, sexism was definitely talked about in terms of eating disorders, right? But these other layers of intersectionality weren't really talked about, like racism, queerness, anti-fatness was not even talked about back then, which is wild to think about. Disability justice, like these other layers of oppression really weren't acknowledged. And it was only in my graduate studies, I went to a master's program in mental health that was really social justice centric. I went to a school in New Mexico that was, near a border town. And so there was a lot of influence from the local geographic issues and mental health. And so a lot of my professors were non-white and they had really unique perspectives. And it was just like fully embedded in our program, which I feel so grateful for looking back on, because it led me to understand how these deeper layers of systemic oppression shaped me. And at the time, I was I was still in a very active part of recovery. I would say I was past like some, I was at a point where I was obviously like stable and stuff to be there, but like there was still layers I was trying to understand about myself. And and that's when I realized like that eating disorders and the way that they are often framed, especially historically, is incomplete because they are so much shaped by these systemic forces. And while there are genetic and individual and familial components that we have to look at, we also need to look at these bigger layers, because the amount of shame that I felt navigating recovery and being told, like, you are an anorexic. I was literally told that. Feeling like just so much blame and shame and just feeling like broken really didn't help. That wasn't a support group that I was told, that I should say. That wasn't my therapist, but that was in like one of those ABA, Anorexic and Bulimics Anonymous support groups. And they have like a 12-step model. And that was my very first like step towards recovery. And they made me say, like, I'm Allyson, I'm an anorexic. And I hated it. I hated it. I felt so dehumanized. I never went back. And then I was like, well, fuck, if this is what recovery is, like, I don't want this. So that shame prevented me from really getting help. I just didn't feel like that was healing. A huge part of my own healing and understanding was understanding that this wasn't my fault, that this was something that I was like indoctrinated in, and that we're all surrounded by constantly. And I don't mean that in a way of like suffering is inevitable and change isn't possible, but what I mean is like it makes sense that we struggle this way with our bodies, and we can alleviate a lot of shame if we acknowledge that. And we restore our agency too when we acknowledge that. I wasn't like born just with this desire to starve myself and hate my body. This is something that was conditioned. And then we can make a choice of, okay, do my values align with this way I've been conditioned, or is there another way? And what does that look like? And even if it's scary and unknown and all the things, like that's what really rooted me in a place of like long-term meaningful recovery. Um, so my whole purpose of having my Instagram, there's kind of two big purposes. One is to get these conversations out there, to sort of push up against like mainstream recovery narratives. Um, the other is that recovery is um, so inaccessible to so many people because there's so many financial barriers. And so I have my podcast. I offer a lot of like insights and education on my account, and that is meant for like people who cannot access a therapist or a dietitian to at least have some educational information on some of these things, because um that like I really believe knowledge is power, and not that you're going to be healed through an Instagram account. However, it's something that I just hope provides a sense of understanding and hope for people So yeah, that's my motivation behind it all.
Yeah. So the big paradigm shift for you was I'm moving from I'm an anorexic to what I'm doing makes sense given the context that I grew up in.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have worded it at the time as this makes sense. Like, I see that now. But what it did for me at the time was like it allowed me to have enough distance from it to define myself how I wanted to. So like it gave me some agency back.
That's so interesting because one of the complaints or opposition that I'll often hear to taking a more systemic approach to understanding mental health and what gets broken or what hurts is people will say, well, if you're looking at larger systems, then are we taking responsibility off the individual or are we making you sort of the helpless victim of that? And what you're describing is really the opposite, where when I recognize the systemic forces that played into what I was experiencing, now what I'm experiencing is not the absolute truth. It's something that came from outside me. It's not the absolute truth and it's not the truth of who I am.
Yes, exactly. And I'm really cautious of that narrative of like, well, everything's fucked, so there's really no hope for healing. That is so harmful. I don't believe or promote that. I do think the systems we live in are completely effed. And I know that it is possible to find healing even in this really imperfect world. I've seen it in myself, I've seen it in my clients, my friends, and I don't mean that like things are perfect, but we do have agency, and some of us have more power and privilege than others and resources. Mm, but we all like there I do believe that there is hope for all of us because if you look at the key ingredients of what really helps people recover, it comes down a lot of the times to relationships and having safe relationships and building that within ourselves and selves. And that's something that comes from community. That's something that we've had throughout time as humans. And so yeah, I hear that pushback about like the limitations of a systemic lens, but I think it's the way that it's talked about, like the way that you talk about that with a client makes all the difference. And it's also not saying that having a systemic lens is better or a replacement for the other treatments we have. That's not it at all. Like liberation psychology is more like having balance and harmony with different modalities of healing. So that means that things like psychodynamic work, CBT can coexist with like liberatory and systemic perspectives, and it's not like one or the other.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that also you're holding the dialectic between things can be really fucked up and we can still also maintain that hope
Yeah,
and build the community support around us.
definitely.
When you talk about your therapy and the therapist that you connected with, and there is a kind of chemistry there, which is something that's really interesting about our profession. And you said there was a lot that you covered and a lot that you grew from, and also a lot that wasn't talked about.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what those things were for you that now looking back, you're like, that was important, and I wish there was space for that part of me there?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing left out that wasn't brought up or really acknowledged was my mixed race identity. And so like the ways that like race and specifically, mixed race experiences are totally different for everyone, but my personal experience was, being mixed race in a very, very white suburban American like town. And so there wasn't much acceptance or tolerance of anything other than, the white middle class person. It's not like I grew up in SoCal, right, where we're like a melting pot. There's just different ethnicities all around me now, and I love that, but I just didn't have that growing up, and so I always felt the sense of like I'm separate, I don't belong. There's shame, there was racial experiences I had. Um, and so yeah, none of that was talked about in my therapy, which is interesting to think about. And I remind myself of that as a clinician too, because you can be an incredible therapist and miss things,
Yeah.
you know.
But can you share to the extent that you feel comfortable what that experience was like growing up mixed race in a primarily white environment or community?
Yeah, I didn't think much of it consciously. I was a kid. However, I remember the moment where it became apparent to me that something was different. I must have been in like fourth grade. My brother and I took the bus, and we were getting on the bus to go back home from our school day. And when we got on the bus, the kind of like cool, popular kids were in the back side of the bus. And honestly, people that I thought I was friends with, but they were like holding up a sign saying no burnt tacos past this point.
What?
Yeah.
Oh
And
my,
so I don't even know how, like looking back, like what the hell was the bus driver doing? I don't understand. But yeah, so my brother and I, like, I just remember being like, whoa, like really scared. Not scared physically, but that was the moment I was like, I don't belong, or they don't see me as the same. And from that point on, again, this was pretty unconscious, but I see it now as I'm looking back. At that point on, I thought, I'm gonna really just try to disguise this part of myself as much as I can. I didn't want anyone to know that I was Indonesian, Mexican. I was only okay, like, telling them, I'm Dutch too, right? So I would just say I'm Dutch, and I would also say I was Hawaiian because people would always ask, like, "Why are you and your brother, like, tan?" or "Where are you guys from?" And so I would just say I was Hawaiian. I would disguise my middle name, which is Inez, which kids would make fun of, so I told people it was Rochelle. I Yeah, like, I feel so sad for that version of me that felt like she just couldn't be who she was. And I think that's when the disconnect really started between not just my authentic self, but, like, my body. Like, I felt like this part of me was wrong, and I had to, like, hide it, and that also translated to body stuff because, naturally, I was curvier, still in a very, straight-sized body that has a lot of privilege, but I was curvier than my white peers who, yeah, had a much thinner frame. And so that was part of it, was like, okay, everyone around me seems to really prize thinness and whiteness. And like, what can I do to try to like assimilate as much as I can? And, I do have light skinned privilege. So I just want to acknowledge too that there is like some black and brown people cannot disguise who they are in any way. So, yeah, but that was what kinda separated me from myself and where the eating disorder stuff started.
yeah. I can't believe that there were no adults around that would notice that and do something that's so just wild. So
Yeah.
you were taught from pretty young, and as kids, we pick up on things, and kids pick up on things also, where you maybe don't have a name for it, but there's a feeling like I'm different in some
Mhm.
way. And I'm different in the fact that I descend from people who are Mexican and Indonesian, and that's a part of me that is not welcome here.
Yeah, and the rejection became inwards, but it also, I look back and really ashamed, to admit that I also projected that on other people. So, and that's like such a interesting reflection of how that happens in society too, how like minorities get pitted against each other in an effort to like separate yourself from. less privileged people, which I never really thought of. But yeah, I think that was like a microcosm of that.
What do you feel like was passed on to you in terms of the story about your heritage? And as you're being taught from the outside to silence that, how did that play out in relationship with family?
I felt ashamed of them too. So I didn't prefer to have friends over at my house because my mom is darker skinned than me and my brother. It was harder to like hide the fact that we were different. And also, like, the things that we ate were different. Like, the foods were different that my mom would cook for dinner than my peers. So that too felt like uh, unmasking, I guess, essentially. Interestingly, when I got into like high school, there was a little bit more diversity, not a lot by any means, but, like, instead of 5 non-white kids, there was probably, like, 12. And I guess, that does make a difference, though, because it suddenly felt like, I guess, less alone and, like, like, there was popular kids of different races. And so there was, like, an understanding there between some of us, even though we never spoke about it, not once. It was just, I don't know, a shared familiarity, a feeling. And then I was a little less I felt a little less shame, but that was also because suddenly being mixed race was, like, exoticized. It was, like, sexualized. So instead of the, like, "What are you?" stuff, it was like, "Wow, like, you're so exotic," like, just those kind of comments or really sexualized comments about my body, um, which was equally uncomfortable. I remember feeling so, like, "I don't wanna be seen," like, "Please don't perceive me," and yeah, so and then, like, I just even remember, like, walking home from school, in high school, and people it's so I hope this doesn't still happen, but I probably it does, but I remember, like, older men in trucks, like, honking and hollering and hooting at me and my friends, and, like, we were, like, 15, like but those experiences, I remember feeling, like, so unsafe in my body, and yeah, like, I think all of that together just it didn't help me connect to myself.
I imagine that's a softened statement of what it did to you.
Yeah.
So, as a child, you're being told that these parts of me, the non white parts of me, are not welcome here. But then you get to high school, and those parts of you are exotic and they're beautiful, and they're also still objectified.
Yes.
So, the story that you're being given there is that, on the one hand, being brown or being mixed is shameful. And on the other hand, it's also kind of sexy, and maybe people are attracted to it in some way.
Yeah, it was like, it's only good if, like, the male gaze approves kind of a thing. It's only good if it can be sexualized in some way. So yeah, equally objectifying and dehumanizing, but it felt better than the outright rejection, at least at the time, what I would tell you. I mean, looking back, I can really argue that, but it felt more socially acceptable.
Attention of any kind is kind of nicer than being shut down or silenced.
Mhm. Yeah, and because we're so socialized to seek approval of men, right, as women, and so, yeah, it felt like approval.
Yeah. How do you now, looking back, see all of that as playing into your eating disorder story?
I think that there was a lot of shame, a lot of self-hatred, a lot of need to disconnect from my body, um, and so, yeah, the eating disorder made me feel like well, it numbed my emotions, it also helped me, like, assimilate more to the ideal body, which made me feel a little bit more accepted externally. It's like almost like in what way it's hard to untangle them at all. Like, I feel like it was such a protective response. Of course, it was destructive, but I don't know, it just totally it's like I was living in a dissociative, like, state, so I didn't really have to, like, feel all of the pain. I couldn't even named it at the time.
Yeah, they're so closely tied together that it's hard to even pull them apart. It's almost like the eating disorder was the behavioral manifestation of what you were experiencing.
Yeah, it was like internalized depression. And, the other interesting thing is that, like, in my family line, every woman in my direct, like my mom, my grandmother, there's definitely like a fixation on body and food. And that was heightened when, from what I know, when my grandmother immigrated. So she also felt a lot of pressure to assimilate to whiteness. And I was told she, like, wanted to be a model and all these things, and, I mean, to this day, is still really focused on her body and weight. So there's, like, this intergenerational pattern too that was happening in the background that I can see as well.
It's almost like if I'm being rejected for something so fundamental to who I am, I have to compensate for
Yes,
it by being perfect on these other metrics of what's considered an acceptable woman.
right. Definitely.
Yeah. If my skin color is not right as defined by these people, at least I can make my body shape.
Exactly. Yep. That was exactly what I felt. And then I think that the experiences of being, like, sexualized and objectified, and there was also trauma that obviously I don't wanna get into, but I think those experiences also fed the disconnection within my body and also made me want to just, like, hide away. So if I could reduce the appearance of parts of my body that were sexualized, then, like, somehow that felt safer. So I think that was definitely a thread too.
Yeah. Was that more openly spoken about in therapy?
Yes, not a lot, but it was. When my therapist at the time would try to go there, I would be like, "No, that has nothing to do with my eating disorder." Like, I wouldn't have even called it trauma, at the time. I wouldn't have even identified it as sexual trauma or sexual objectification.
Yeah, and like looking back on it at the same time, and tell me if I'm understanding, maybe it was helpful for her to have that understanding, even if you didn't see it that way, because she knew there was something there. And she knew
Yeah.
what to ask and how to open that space for you if you did want to make that connection.
Yes, she would drop seeds here and there, and I'd always be like, "What are you talking about?" But later, decades later, I'm like, "Yeah, okay, that makes sense." And she would talk about it in a different angle, like, she did talk a lot about the role of, like, sexism and things like that, not in an educational way, but she would just bring it up in terms of, like, my experience, or she was really empowering for me to, like, find my own voice and, like, lean into my own passions outside of what I was told to seek because at the time my very first session with her, so I was at the time married to a military man, which is a whole other story. We divorced, but I would have said that my reason for recovery, and I was like 20 years old at the time, was so that, like, I could have kids one day. And, like, I had no other aspirations. If, like, I just saw myself as this, like, I'm just gonna be this, like, housewife that has kids. Even though before my eating disorder, I had tons of dreams and goals. I mean, I went through undergrad, I was getting a bachelor's in psychology, like, but my eating disorder really shrank my world. And this person I was in a relationship with, that went well for his very, like, traditional view of gender roles, but my therapist would really challenge it. And she knew I loved psychology. She knew that there was that fire underneath. And so she actually, at some point in my recovery, encouraged me to like apply for my graduate program. And like almost like gave me permission, not permission, but like in a really subtle way, like you don't have to do this thing that you think like you're 20 years old and you want you're like I don't know, I guess she could just sense that like that life wasn't what I really wanted. I don't know how, but she just did. And yeah, so there was a lot of, I guess, like feminist therapy, a lot of challenging like internalized sexism.
So you had some of the recognition of systemic forces and found it helpful in some way even then.
Yeah.
What
Yes.
you're advocating now is for that to be extended to
Yeah.
other areas of discrimination or systemic oppression, like
Yeah.
racism.
Exactly. Yeah.
What would you have wanted her to know at the time if you could go back? What would you have wanted your therapist to know or to know to ask?
Hmm. That's a hard question because I mean, I guess, of course, like some exploration of my how I feel about my ethnicity. I think that could have been something I would have received if she was to come in like, well, this is like a product of white supremacy. I would have been like, what? She would have lost me. Um, But if there was some gentle curiosity, I think that could have been really helpful. And at the same time though, like, I mean, I think she had a really specific role in my recovery and she helped me a lot. Like even just the feminist lens through sexism, it was kind of like whitewashed feminism. However, that was like a starting point for me to like unpack more. I remember seeing her at like protests in town. Um, the recovery books she recommended to me were not like Life Without Ed, although I did read that, but she gave me one called like Body Wars, and it was all about like sexism and eating disorders basically. And so she really planted some pretty strong seeds. Even though, yeah, there was some things missing, and like she had me do things like body tracing, which I'm like looking back, no, can we not do that? Um,
What is body tracing? I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, it's when it's like a kind of an old school eating disorder intervention, but it's when you get like a huge sheet of paper, like a construction type of paper, and you have your client draw what they think their body looks like the size and shape of it. And then you lay down on the paper over what you traced, and then the therapist traces around you. And the idea is to be like, okay, look at the discrepancy, like you aren't that quote unquote big. So
Mhm.
there's still this really like fat phobic energy around it. There's still this message of like, see, you're not that quote unquote fat, or you're not that big, or whatever. And I remember being like, I so I also am neurodivergent and she did not clock that. But I remember having no concept of like what my body actually looked like. So when she asked me to trace it, I just remember doing what I thought she wanted me to do. So I saw where this was going. I knew she wanted to be like, see, your self-image is wrong. So I remember just like making it, yeah, like just people pleasing really. But yeah, I had no idea like where my body ended or began. Like that was not something I had access to.
Yeah.
So yeah, she did like, and again, like that's a reminder I carry with me as a therapist is like you can fuck up, but you can also really help. Like, like you don't have to be the perfect therapist to be like life changing.
And none of us are, and that also challenges the notion around. I feel like there's so much, and part of what this podcast is in response to is there's so many ideological wars, and I feel like the reason why we fight so hard partly is because there's so much shame at getting something wrong.
Yeah.
And the movement you're describing is just maybe I didn't know this about you, and maybe I didn't know this about the way that your identity was impacting you, and that was really important. And I imagine your therapist, just from what I'm hearing about her, would be receptive to that even
Oh,
now, if you in some alternate reality would have that conversation with her. And I can both help you and have been unaware of something that I'm still learning.
yes. I mean, the relationship we had was so safe and solid that I I know we would have repaired that had I had words for it or had we had, it was only years later that I reflected on how not helpful that was. So, but yeah, she's like retired now. There would be no way to do that. And actually, so I saw her for like 4 years, and then, I moved from that state to California, and I didn't have therapy for a while. I was in a pretty good place of recovery. Then COVID hit, and still was good eating disorder-wise, but had a major OCD flare, and I reached out to her in a panic, and we actually worked together again for, like, another year before she retired because she was a psychologist, and so she had, like, reciprocity during COVID, so she could see me in a different state, and that was really interesting, like, because she had been with me through the eating disorder, but we weren't focused on food and body as much in that last year we worked together, and then she retired, and that was how why we stopped working together, and that was, like, a whole grief, like, so sad. I was so sad for a while, and it was, she sent me, like, so many of her, like, therapy books because she was retiring, and I was in the field of therapy as a newer clinician at the time. So there was, like, a really meaningful dynamic that we had.
That's such a beautiful relationship.
Yeah, I really miss her.
Yeah. And she was able to see you probably through different stages. Where were you in your own therapist process during COVID?
I had just gotten licensed. So I was navigating leaving a really like toxic agency job where I was completely overworked and underpaid. And I was stepping in to work for a group practice, and that was a much better fit. However, it was a huge change, and then lockdown hit. And so it was like so much. I was dealing with like burnout from the agency job, but then also like how to adapt into this group practice thing that was so different than agency work, like I didn't have anything externally validating my worth, if that makes sense. Like in agency work, you're with your supervisor all the time, and they're always like, you're doing great, or you could look at this, or, there was so much direction. And then I was in this role where I had such little oversight, and the people seemed to trust me so much. And that felt like a huge scary responsibility, and that triggered a lot of self-doubt and this OCD spiral. So, yeah, it was, like, still tied to self-worth and stuff, though, so it was helpful to see her because she knew me so well, and even though we weren't talking about food and body, we were still talking about things like self-worth and trusting myself and perfectionism and stuff like that.
You mentioned that you saw her once at a protest. What message did that send you? And how do you relate to that now?
Yeah, it was like I just remember being like, "Oh my gosh, what?" And just feeling, like, really excited, and, like, "Wow, she's such a badass," kind of a thing, like, she doesn't have to be here, and I guess it made me feel like, the things she talks about, the little seeds she would drop, right, about challenging sexism and stuff like that, that really was part of her values, and she really genuinely cared about those things, and so I think the protest was at the time of the first Trump election, and so it was just cool to feel like we were there together. We weren't there together, but, like, we were at the protest at the same time.
Mhm. The message was that there's a shared value system and also that this is someone who really stands for what she believes in.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And at the same time, like, I told you she sent me her old like clinical therapy books and stuff when she retired. I saw her at this protest. At the same time, she was so boundaried in a really good way. And like I remember thinking when she retired, being like, well, now can we just like stay in touch? Like, can we just be friends? You're not going to be a therapist anymore. And she's like, no, like we can't. And I already knew that obviously as a therapist, but there was just this part of me that didn't want to grieve and lose her. And at the time I was so sad, right? But looking back, I'm so grateful for that because she preserved, like by holding those good clinical boundaries, she like preserved the way that the therapy with her still benefits me today. Like was psychodynamic in nature, so she would talk about like introjects and things like that. And so she's like, if you see my like messy human non-therapy self and you like all that, like it's gonna change the way that like you internalize our work together. And I really think she was true.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
I recently had to terminate a few clients because of schedule changes, so I've been thinking about termination, and that's really interesting. So you feel like that sharp boundary, and that's kind of an absolute, we don't really have much choice about that, but that sharp boundary around I'm your therapist always, even when I'm not your therapist anymore, allowed you to preserve the work that you did together and the way that you interpreted that work together. Whereas if you would have seen her just messy human self, that would have almost reframed all the work you did together.
Yeah, yeah, and like she wasn't so harsh in the sense that like she did self-disclose. I knew things about her life, but it always had a purpose. It always was some type of related to my therapy process. So she wasn't like super rigid either, but the big things, she was firm on. And so yeah, I don't want to make it sound like she was this like total blank slate.
That leads us to you had mentioned in email wanting to push back on the notion that therapists are apolitical. Can you talk to me about what does it mean for you bringing politics into the therapy process and how you navigate that alongside the boundaries you're talking about with clients now?
Yeah, I mean, so because I'm pretty vocal, right? Like online on my podcast with where I stand, like I really don't get clients that are have such different values than me. And the feedback I get is like that they feel like I get it, that they're safe, that they know where I stand, especially right now in such a polarized political climate. So there's a level of safety and trust, I think, that is there. In terms of how I bring it up in therapy, I'm not like bringing up, oh my gosh, did you see what Trump did today? Like it's not like I'm talking about it that way. It's more like how my therapist was with me, like planting seeds or like getting really curious with clients about like where this messaging comes from. When did you first hear that being queer was bad, right? And like what things shaped those beliefs, what experiences, like it's more like that. It's not like intentionally bringing politics into the session. It's more like not shying away when those things inevitably come up because politics affect all of us.
The message you're communicating when you say not being apolitical is politics impact you, and I can
Yeah.
recognize that they impact you, and you can bring that in here if it's impacting you.
Yeah, like life is not apolitical. So how could good therapy be? But it's not about like convincing a client what to believe in either. It's just like holding space for how things are impacting them, how food stamps being cut is impacting them, how I don't know, things like trying to deal with like a white supervisor in the workplace when you're a brown person, and like navigating these things that are just part of our life. And knowing when, like, suggesting something like breathing exercises for some multiply marginalized person who is struggling to have safe housing, like how that's so inappropriate and dismissive, right? Like, so that's kind of what I mean is like being able to read the room and be real about the world we live in.
Yeah. And there's an aspect of that also in terms of just not gaslighting. If somebody's coming in with, this is so painful, you're not there to challenge that.
No, right, exactly.
You can move through that along with them.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of specific scenarios there. So one is if somebody's working with or for a white supervisor as a brown person. Can you tell me what does the therapy process around that look like?
It would look like exploring power dynamics, exploring even like how power dynamics show up in the therapy room, like relating that to what they're experiencing on the outside world, helping them have perspective and frame like a framework for why this manager is so abrasive, maybe specifically with this one person, for an example. I just as an example, and like helping them see that, like, they're not the problem, the client's not the problem, but that there is this huge power dynamic, and sometimes, for example, white supervisors will feel really threatened by a really good employee who happens to be brown or black because there's this notion of, like, they could take my job and, you know, things like that. So, there can be friction a lot of times, and so it'd be supporting the client and navigating that in a way that doesn't make them diminish themselves, but also doesn't threaten their safety.
So if somebody's coming in maybe with a lot of shame because they're being mistreated, or because maybe their culture is just really not understood and there's a culture clash,
Mhm.
then when you're exploring the power structures and even the way those power structures might play out in the therapy room, the message you're giving, similar to what you received when you started to look at systemic forces in your own life, is it's not that there's something wrong or broken about you.
Yes, exactly. Like, it might be more like, what do you think the role of, your supervisor being white and you being brown, like, how does that play into this? Where have you felt this way before? That kind of stuff. So, yeah, not shying away from those conversations.
Yeah. I'm trying to play out in my mind what that then looks like when they bring it back to their workplace. I know you mentioned being able to bring it up without compromising your safety or being able to
Mhm.
release the shame without compromising your safety. What kind of conversation or shift, or I don't know, I imagine for sure it depends a lot on the what feels okay in that workspace as well. But what have you seen that translate to when the client moves back into their life?
Sometimes it's not a situation where the client could go to the supervisor and be like, "Hey, you're being racist," or report them to HR and hope for the best, right? Like, sometimes that would we just know that would not end well, and the client could be out of a job then, right? And so it looks more like having an energetic boundary while you're in the workplace and knowing, like, "Okay, my boss is racist. This is not about me. This is about his or her own stuff." And then having a really supportive community of like-minded people outside of the work setting. So, like, building up supportive community with other Black or brown people who are able to say, "Yeah, that happened to me too," or, "Yeah, this is how I got through it." And it's yeah, it's a reality that BIPOC people face is, like, we do have to sometimes make ourselves smaller to survive. That was, like, my whole story of recovery, right? But it also happens in, like, workplace settings and every facet of society.
But what about in a relationship that maybe is a less hierarchical in less ways, or in a relationship where there is more space, where the person might be receptive to hearing, maybe not "you are racist," because most people tend to have strong reactions to that. But what does that look like when there is systemic oppression and maybe this person is discriminating unintentionally? How does
Yeah,
the conversation or what is worked on in therapy translate in those kind of instances?
in those kinds of instances, I think, again, assuming that it's a safe relationship, assuming that the person, wants to support and understand the client, then it would look like, how do we facilitate a conversation with this person to share how you feel, how them saying X, Y, and Z makes you feel. And it's not necessarily about being like, you're racist, but it might be like, when you say those stereotypes or make fun of people that look like me, like, it makes me feel horrible. Have you thought about like what that's rooted in, and like, it's all kind of about, is that other person willing to learn and adapt? So, yeah, learning, like, helping clients feel emotionally supported in those conversations. Sometimes it's like role playing. How would you wanna go about this? Um, and what do you need to feel like you can trust this person? If they are open to receiving it, like, what does repair look like?
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I wish we could keep talking. One last question, and
Yeah.
then we'll wrap up. And you mentioned this doesn't come up for you often, or maybe not at all, because you have a strong social media presence and are pretty vocal about your beliefs. So people know who you are, and if they're coming to you, there's an alignment in belief system. Has there ever been a situation where someone came into you with different political beliefs?
Yes. Not in
Has,
private practice, but definitely, like, in agency work where I didn't have any say over who I work with, yes, and it was hard. I think, though, like, my go-to is to focus on the feelings, right, and get really curious of, like, what, tell me more about that belief, like, where does that come from, what do to kind of bring it back to the feelings versus the ideology, is how I would go about that.
yeah. So you can establish a relationship with someone and with the emotions or experiences underneath their belief system, even if you don't agree with their beliefs.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've had to do that in my own family, so I'm pretty. Yeah. I don't love it, I will say, it's not my preference, but yes, I think that as therapists, like, being able to see the human in people is really important, and of course, like, we do not have to work with everyone, however, there's like I think good therapists can establish some empathy and compassion even if they don't wanna work with the person, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. I feel like your perspective is so balanced in so many ways. And what I hear when people push back against therapists being political is a belief that almost if you say you're being political, it means you're entering a therapy session with an agenda and then projecting that on the client. So, what I hear when you're talking about it is so much more about just knowing where to look and where to help a client see themselves, and also letting people know that there's nothing here that's unspeakable.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Elka, this was such a dynamic conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much.